blame Ken. We're in a spirit of continuous improvement, so if things don't go well, it's because we're taking risks and trying to make them better, and that's part of the process of continuous improvement. We hope you'll do the same. I want to start, first of all, by thanking some of the people at the Agency of Education who are really working hard, and I want to call out a couple of things that I think they're doing, and hope that sort of sets the stage for your work for them today. One of the things that we are working really hard on is continuous improvement. We know that this work is really, really hard, and the team at the agency, and I hope you're beginning to feel this, has really been working hard over the last couple of years to not just focus on compliance with federal policies, not least of all because we know these policies don't work for us. We need to create that compliance bucket of what you have to do to keep those funds moving and keep those schools in compliance with the law. But we really need to focus on continuous improvement. And what they're trying to do is bring together the compliance tasks so that you can deal with them quickly and efficiently in this process, but then create space for you to really focus on the hard work of making schools better. And in that context, to try to bring together many of the different initiatives across the agency, whether it's MTSS, really finding multiple systems of support for kids to ensure that every child has that opportunity to learn, together with all the other pieces around improvement planning, so that it's not you trying to deal with 20 different initiatives, but you really trying to sit down and work hard with your staff to come up with one coherent vision of what you want your school to be and what the next step of work is for you in terms of reaching that. We know we're not 100% there yet. We are working hard to do it, and we do really value your feedback because you are the end. You're really the user of these tools that we try to create, and we need you to let us know so that we can continue to improve them and make our processes really serve your processes. Because at the end of the day, your work is what it's all about. You are the ones working directly with kids. You are the ones making a difference in the classroom, and we are only effective if what we do is actually helping you with that goal. So I want to really thank our ISL team and our other people who are here today trying to coordinate with you, and just also want to thank Ken personally for dealing with my last minute addition of slides because I used to having to adjust on the fly. So with that said, let's talk AYP, and I put up a little sign for you because we are all now in suspension. And I think you know that as of this year, except for 8 schools who really might have or probably would have been failing to make AYP this year, except that they were frozen because they took we had to use their last year's scores because if you pilot Smarter Balance this year, obviously there are no scores to make a determination this year. So the fact that 8 schools are out is really a function of just a historical happenstance that we happen to be shifting standards. And for all intents and purposes, we're all failing. We're all low performing according to the federal government. And on the one hand, that feels terrible. On the other hand, it presents a real opportunity because has anyone else here ever spent time in detention in your school? Okay, thank you, so did I. Good to know there's at least one of us who made it here. But you know, when everybody's in detention, or when your entire class is getting an after-school detention of some sort, you got to go back and look at your system because there's something about the system that isn't right or isn't capturing what's important. And that's sort of where we are. So because we're all in this together, we're out of the naming and the blaming and the shaming. By not shifting to a waiver, we don't have to go through that whole process again, but on steroids. And what we really can do is work together and to try to leverage the best of what we know about Vermont, the best of what you know about practice, and put our heads together and try to figure out how to do this better for kids. So I know this feels terrible. I'm going to encourage you not to think of it as terrible because we're all in the same position, and in some ways it's liberating. Let's move on. Let's move on to the real work, what brings you to work every day, which is figuring out how to do this better for our students. So we got to start by asking, what's our purpose? What do we care about? Why do we do this work? Because everything you do in your plan, if it isn't addressing your purpose, it isn't worth wasting your time on. Just get it done as quickly as you can. A little bit of context, because I think we need to keep this perspective, because this is what's driving the national federal accountability. We know that we are facing radical transformations in the workforce and radical transitions in how people do work and our citizens because of things like technology. We know that our students need much higher levels of skill. It used to be that 60% of the jobs that were available for our graduates were considered low-skilled jobs that you get with just a high school diploma. Now about 20% of those jobs are considered unskilled. And I threw up the cows and the farmer sitting on his computer. Even traditionally, jobs that traditionally didn't require a lot of education are now requiring high levels of education and an ability to reason from evidence, use technology, solve unstructured problems. We really need to provide this broader, deeper skill set to all of our students, or we're not preparing them for the world that they're entering and not helping them understand that isn't serving them well, and I know you believe that too. So how are we doing? Let's just talk about what we do know about how we're doing. And you've seen this if you had a chance to see the letter that the agency sent out. We know that we're 7th in the world in 8th grade math and 4th in science in a study that compares the performance of U.S. states to 47 countries through the Trends in International Math and Science study. Doesn't seem too bad. In fact, we know that if we brought Singapore here and put all their schools in Vermont, they'd probably all be low-performing schools too, okay? So on the National Assessment of Education Progress, we're pretty consistently near the top of the pile. We had a Wallet Hub. This is one of those financial sector predictors. It's the new sort of wave in social media. They looked at 12 different metrics, not just math and English language arts scores, and they put us 3rd in the nation in terms of school performance and outcomes, looking at a broader range of outcomes. And, as you know, under No Child Left Behind, we're all identified as low performing. This doesn't make sense. This isn't useful to us in terms of our work, so we need to leave this behind. And we need to trust ourselves and ask ourselves, what is the job we're trying to do? What is the evidence that speaks to how well we're doing it? And how can we use that evidence to move this really critical, important work of helping our students learn more, and particularly the students who traditionally haven't been well served by our schools, students from low-income backgrounds who are living in poverty, and in particular, our low-income boys. The logic, let's just be really clear about what we're talking here. This is a logic of school improvement that comes out of Washington. The logic of No Child Left Behind is that if we can identify and sanction the low performers, in this case schools, we can get to 100% proficiency. Sort of like the Chainsaw Al Dunlop model of school improvement. We're going to find the bottom 10%, we'll sanction them, and then we'll move on. Doesn't work. The logic of the waivers that we were offered, we didn't take a waiver because frankly, it's all the same problems we have under No Child Left Behind, but just move to the level of teachers and put on steroids. It isn't going to work. So why don't we support this logic? Because if it was that easy, if just firing 10% of teachers would get us all to proficiency, don't you think we would have done it? That's not the problem. Teaching isn't that easy. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm sure many of you would say the same. And we are also dealing with changing demographics, incredibly complex problems around moving all students to higher levels of performance than we ever expected them to achieve. The data doesn't always serve us in the case of Vermont. In very small schools and classes, estimates based on test scores may be highly reliable. All these models are only valid or useful to us if they actually predict future performance. If I give you a value-added model and say, Shelley, this year you are top of the pile, that means I have to be able to assume and trust that Shelley will be top of the pile next year. Or if I find her low at the bottom of the pile and I fire her, I have to be firing her because I'm confident that next year she would also be at the bottom of the pile. Because if it's not reliable, if she's top one year and bottom the next year, oops, I might have fired the teacher who was best able to serve those kids. That's a mistake we can't afford to make. And it's particularly important we not make it because we can't afford to discourage our best teachers from embracing the privilege and the challenge of teaching our most vulnerable students. So if we're using bad tools to decide what's good teaching, we're discouraging exactly the behaviors we want. We want every teacher who's the best teacher in our building to be running to teach the kids who need their help the most. And we can't use tools to discourage it. This is an example from our school level data. Any problem you see in the school level data is ×2 when you get to teacher level data. What you see is this cone shape this is the scores on the mean school scores on the 11th grade math test. And you see that kind of cone shape? On the bottom axis, that's for larger schools as you move up to the right. So the top, I'm afraid if I go over here, I'll lose the wire. If you go over here, this is a school that's pretty big and pretty high scoring. Notice what happens when you come over to the small schools. You see how you get this funnel shape. That's because this is measurement error. One kid moves in who doesn't, maybe they're coming from another country and they haven't had any formal education. Well, they may not be easy, it may not be an easy transition into taking the NECAP test, but we don't give them permission to not take the NECAP test. So that one student coming in might drag down that school for that year. If you've only got 9 kids, that's a big proportion of your score. It's going to bring you way down. Next year, they move on to the next grade. Guess what's going to happen? The 11th grade scores may bounce up again. So what you see in our small schools is one year they're at the top of the pile, the next year they're at the bottom of the pile. That has nothing to do with the quality of your program. That has to do with the number of students that you have and random error. So we can't make policy decisions and decisions about hiring and firing based on that kind of unreliable data. It's just not professionally responsible. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what can we do? What do we know? and how can we use that to make good decisions. Some of you have seen this. I'm just putting this up to remind us. Many of us in the state are in schools where our score reports look like this. In fact, if we reported data the way Massachusetts does, 80% of our schools would get suppressed data on their score reports. That means you wouldn't get data telling you how you were operating and how well you were serving students living in poverty compared to other students. So we have to rely on more than just these tools to get meaningful data and meaningful information understanding what is powerful in our schools and what we need to work on. Another reason, this narrow focus on 2 measures, it demeans the other important outcomes that we care about. And if you think about the education quality standards, and I'll come back to that, we care about a lot more than how we do on English and math tests. They are valuable indicators. When I want to know if my car is working well, I do check my oil periodically. But when I check my oil and it's low, I don't fire my car. I've changed the oil. I try to figure out what's going on that I need to fix. And that's the way we need to think about test scores. It's not the health of your car. It's a leading indicator that tells you something about how your car might be doing. I might have another leak I need to look at. In the same way, test scores aren't learning. Let's not confuse test scores with learning. However, they are a very powerful tool for getting a little bit of insight into how we might improve learning. But those are different things. We need to use test scores to inform smart decisions about teaching and learning, but we should not confuse them for our purpose. If your goal in your school is to improve test scores, you are missing the boat, because there's a lot that's not captured on those tests that's really important to helping our kids thrive in college and communities as members of our Vermont civic culture, and we need to honor that as well. These test scores don't account adequately for differences outside of school that make it easier or harder for students to learn at high levels. One of the things we haven't really called out is that poverty, the rate of poverty in our schools, child poverty, is increasing. In some schools more than others. I was talking to a place where the school poverty, the eligibility for free and reduced lunch had jumped from something like 30% to 60% over the last couple of years. I don't need to tell you, because you know what you would expect to have happen to those test scores. And it didn't. So what would you say? What would you conclude about that school? I would say, good job, folks, because you are dealing with much, much more challenging circumstances, and you have kept the level of learning where it was. Do we want to go higher? Absolutely. So does every teacher in that building. But it doesn't mean they're not doing some things that seem to be making a difference. So be smart and be sophisticated about how you use these tools, and make sure people are really paying attention to the whole story. And then finally, when we put too much I've sort of addressed this, but when we put too much pressure on teachers to improve test scores, we may compel them to focus on improving test scores rather than using test scores to improve learning. And I can't tell you how important that is and how many times we have to say that over and over to our teachers and to our parents and to our legislators, because when teachers' professionalism is judged based on these test scores, we are reducing their job to test scores. And we can't let that happen, because our children need much more from us than that. So, am I dating myself? Those of you who haven't seen this Breakfast Club, that means you're really young. Now we are all in detention, so what do we do next? We start by looking at equity. What do we know about our school? And this is the NAEP data. I'm using the NAEP data because actually one of the things I'm really proud of about Vermont is when you look at our kneecap scores, there's actually very little evidence that anyone in the state is trying to game the test. We don't see score inflation on the kneecaps the way some states are seeing on their state tests. So kudos to you. That suggests that you're using test scores the right way. But I do think the NAEP is interesting because it does illustrate it's the same stuff we see in our kneecap data, but it sort of gives you another outside reference point on it. So the top line, these are more affluent students in Vermont, students who aren't eligible for free and reduced lunch. And what you notice is we consistently outscore the nation. This is just 8th grade math, but you do see this in several other panels as well. And not only that, what you see is a slight widening of a gap between us and the nation nationwide. So our students are doing pretty well relative to other more affluent students in the country. And in fact, the gains for our high-income students are a little bit greater than the gains nationally for high-income students. And then here, down here, these are the 2 lines for our students who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. And this is Vermont. And we're a little flat in here, coming down, in a period when you see nationally gains continuing to increase. And actually, it's hard to tell from this, but in this last period, the gains for low-income students are actually a little faster nationwide than they are in Vermont. And what you see, because this line is a little flatter than this one, we are currently increasing the gap, the achievement gap between students living in poverty and more affluent states in Vermont. Now, I was at CCSO a couple weeks ago, and the response, or the statement there, was we got to double down because we have to close the gap. And my thinking is we don't want to double down on a policy that's currently increasing the achievement gap in Vermont. We need to take a deep breath and step back and ask ourselves why that's happening. Because if we really care about equity of outcomes, what we're doing right now, it isn't getting us where we want to go. So we need to take a deep breath, step back and say, what is it that we are and we aren't doing that might be contributing to this pattern in the data? This is our kneecap data. Many of you have seen this before, but what I'm trying to illustrate is you see the same pattern in some of our reading scores. This is a pattern in Vermont. There are lots of reasons, we'll talk about those in just a second, that explain why this gap exists. Some of it is explained by in-school factors. A lot of it is explained by what's going on outside your classrooms. But overall, we do have some work to do, and I know that you embrace that, as do I. How many people here, by the way, are first generation in their family to go to college? I have to ask this. Okay, I just want to point that out. That says something about teachers, and I went to a PLP conference, and I think the majority of the people raised their hands in the room. That's really powerful, because that's what we're trying to do for those kids in that bar graph. We're trying to say to them that they can do what you did. They can go on, they can have higher aspirations, and they can be in a position through better learning to be able to do what you are trying to do right now for those kids. I think if you went into many other arenas, you wouldn't see that high number of hands being raised. So tip number 2, and this is a pet peeve of mine, and I know this is going to seem a little geeky or wonky and arcane, but bear with me. When you use test scores, let's try to shift the conversation to scale scores and not percent proficient. This is something that really bothers me, because when you focus on percent proficient, the way we're required to do this by federal law, we often occlude or disguise the real story of what's happening in our schools. And we can be lulled into complacency, and we can also miss the story of who's really getting improvements. And we can't learn from each other if we don't know, and I'll show you why in just a second. So a scale score, that's the number that you get, the 234, that tells you, in most cases, what the mean score, on average, how did students score in your building. So that would be in here. This was on the kneecap, so it was different. It was 0 to 80. It'll be a different scale when you get to the smarter balance. But basically, the scale score, hypothetically, let's say for student A, is 66. That puts them right below the cut for proficiency with distinction. Student B, let's say their scale score is 41. That puts them right above the cut score to put them into proficient. Here's what you need to remember about scale scores. First of all, even though these two students are really achieving at very, very different levels, when you talk about them in terms of percent proficient, they're the same. They sound like the same thing. So that using those categories actually gives you much less information about performance than using the scale scores. And it matters. Let's say the bulk of your students were scoring here, if you were a school. Your job is very different than if the bulk of your students was scoring here. Very different. And let's talk about these guys. Here, you have student B at 41, student C at 39. For all purposes, these are basically indistinguishable students in terms of how much math or whatever it is they know. They're the same. Many tests, this is a statistically insignificant difference. But if you talk about them in terms of performance categories, B is much better, even though they know the same amount of math. So think again about the dynamics that this sets up. If you think about a school where a lot of students are right here, if they improve mean achievement just a tiny, tiny bit, they're going to have a huge jump in percent proficient, even if they only improve the scale score of the school by 1 point. On the other hand, a school that takes its students from here to here, or from here to here, may be improving a whole lot, but because in this case they started at a much lower base, and they can't even crack partially proficient because they started at such a low base, even though they make huge gains, it's not even being picked up. It won't even be in there as evidence because you're talking about percent proficient and you haven't moved categories. So just talking about these performance categories can create a really distorted view of who's getting gains. If you want to know who's getting improvements in their school for all their students, you want to look at the mean score. And why does this matter? Because there are schools in Vermont who have eliminated their achievement gap in terms of percent proficient by lowering their mean score. That's not good. We don't want to do that. So it really does matter. Or there's schools that have made tremendous progress, but because they started so low, that isn't evident when you talk about percent proficient, because they're moving a very low distribution towards a higher bar. There are other schools where they may all be scoring as up in here, and they're high score. They're not making much progress, but because of where they happen to sit relative to the cut score, they look like they're making great gains when they're really not. So we need to be more sophisticated. We need to push back on this way of reporting scores, and we are hoping to do that in our score reports. I'm going to go through this quickly because I know most of your day is going to be focused on this, but we need to think about learning in a much more sophisticated way. It has to be about multiple measures. We can't rely on just one indicator of success, because then we're distorting what we do in schools and putting all our pressure on that one indicator. So you will hear about lots of these options, and some of these we are going to be asking you to partner with us and providing incentive grants to schools who want to partner with us to develop some of these tools so we can pilot them and share them out across the state. But performance assessments of proficiency. We need to know, as we move towards a proficiency-based model, we need to know what that looks like. And we need teachers to help us design performance tasks that will help us capture evidence about that. Parent, student, and teacher surveys. Many of you are doing this already. But those are very, very powerful tools to get evidence and feedback on the level of engagement. How safe kids feel in school. We know if you don't feel safe, you will not score well in school because you're stressed. When you're stressed, your working memory is suppressed. It's all connected. So if you do a climate survey and you find out that your kids are feeling that they don't feel safe at school, and they don't feel that they have an adult they can speak to and reach out, they don't have a meaningful relationship with adults, that actually might be your first level of work. You might need to start there before you start with a new curriculum, because that might be your first priority. We need to expand opportunities to learn. We know that 2/3 of what we call the achievement gap is really developed out of school. We know that in the school year, kids tend to hold their own. We know that over the summer, students who are living in poverty often demonstrate declines in reading achievement, but students from high-income families show gains. So that gap widens no matter how well you do during the year when schools aren't in school, or when students aren't in school. There are things that you can do about that. Many of you have partnered with us on 21st Century Grants to extend opportunities for summer learning. Many of you are in the process or have already opened your own preschools. If we can provide students with opportunities to come to school ready to learn, they will be better prepared. And that has to be part of your vision. It has to go beyond what you do in your classrooms. It has to be, how are we expanding those opportunities so that all children arrive at school ready to learn and are adequately supported when they're there so that they can take advantage of all the good teaching you do. We also need to look at teaching. It's not just what we want to teach, but how we do it, because that's where we're going to get traction on the next level. And we need to work with multi-tiered systems of support and ask ourselves, not have students come to the program that we're providing, but how have we created sort of an ecology of a classroom that really is supportive of and responsive to the many diverse needs that students bring to us so that they can all succeed. And we need to look at multiple outcomes. Just I mentioned earlier the education quality standards. We care about more than English language arts and math, though they're essential. We also care about science, civic participation, physical health and wellness, and those critical 21st century skills and artistic expression. Graduation rates, post-secondary attainment, you're going to hear a whole bunch more about this today, so I'm not going to belabor this issue. And then really we need to focus on, make sure we got time here because I know we have to run purposely over. We need to focus on instruction. And one of the things that I've noticed as I go around the state is we spend an awful lot of time talking about what we're going to teach in the context of the Common Core. And that's another, I think it's our current best description of what our goals are for students. It's a great starting point. But the real work is not in what we teach, it's in how we teach it. And it takes a tremendous amount of discipline at your level to make sure we save time for that conversation. And more particularly, we need to ask ourselves if what we are actually doing with kids is consistent with what we say we're doing with kids. And what's been so interesting about some of the protocols that we've been piloting is that what you see is a disconnect. Often we think we're doing something, but when we actually break down our class time and look at transcripts of teaching, it's actually much harder to make those changes than we think it is. And that's not an indictment of teaching, because I could say the same about myself. It's just testimony to how hard this work is and how disciplined and rigorous we have to be about examining classroom practice. So here's an example. just humor me for a minute. Just read this and tell me what you think knowledge is and what are the assumptions about authority in this passage. So transfer to the classroom. What's going on here? This is a real, real classroom transfer. What's knowledge here? So they're creating a tool. What's that?
They're just following directions.
They're following directions. Where is knowledge? Teacher's head. What's the student's job?
Do what the teacher said.
Right. And if you do it, at the end, you're going to have a nice example of student work, won't you? Right? It'll look really good. But what will these students be able to do? I think Livy already kind of said it. What will they be able to do?
Follow directions from the teacher said.
Yeah. So this fosters dependency. This creates a situation where you're going to have a beautiful project at the end, but you can't do it by yourself. You need that teacher there telling you what to do. That's not going to get us to the 21st century skills, and it's not going to improve learning. One guess, what do you think the demographics of this classroom are? Take a wild guess.
High quantity of free and reduced lunch.
Yes, this was a high poverty majority. It was all white, actually. These were all white students in a high poverty school. This one. A little bit different. What's going on here? Okay, so someone venture a guess. What's knowledge in this room? And who has it?
The kids have it. The kids know it from the day before, so she's building on background knowledge.
So the teacher's taught something and she's building on prior knowledge. And what was the source of the knowledge?
Seems like the student presented an example.
Okay, so it's reciprocal, building knowledge together, okay? What else? What will this student be able to do?
Transfer to other learners or to other examples.
Okay, so you're given a body of knowledge and you're able now to transfer it to new context, okay? How is this different from the last one? Okay. Is there a right answer in this classroom? How do we know? Someone said yes. Who said?
Yeah, there's a right answer, but it's being collectively constructed.
Okay. And where do you see it being collectively constructed, the transfer?
The teacher here is using student examples, student recollections, asking questions, just delivering the information.
And she says, I'm glad you gave me that one so that you won't use the wrong one. So there is a correct knowledge out there, but what she's doing is moving them towards a correct answer. And the student says, it wouldn't sound right if you said mouses. And she says, yes, but who can give me a better reason? So there's sort of a hierarchy, though, of logic here. He gave a reason, wasn't good enough. She's made a determination wasn't good enough. She's pushing it. So, think about what's going on there in terms of student authority and voice, how that plays out. Guess on this demographics in this community.
The children that would know that, would have more examples of that, would have had more exposure to a lot of language, so in all probability were less frequent exposure kids in that classroom.
So again, this is an all-white classroom. This is a little higher than the last one. It's still a working class community, but it is a higher income community than the other. That's good. Okay, and I took out the last one. I didn't put in the highest one because I was afraid I'd run out of time. But I think the question is, what do we teach kids, and what are the opportunities we give kids to engage in thinking, and also in opportunities to really generate and create knowledge themselves? And if you went back and you transcribed the lessons in your school, including your own lessons if you teach, and you looked at that transcript, what's the narrative? And looked at those comparisons across different classrooms in your building. If you're a high school and you're a tracked high school, what would the narratives look like in the low track classes versus the high track classes? And what are the assumptions and the beliefs about knowledge and authority that we're communicating? And what are the kinds of opportunities that we give and challenge kids to embrace around creating knowledge? And I think it's just an incredibly powerful exercise. I wanted to give you one last example because I'll end with this this multiple choice test. I put this up here because everyone laughs, but I'll bet you money or chocolate that if you went back to your school, you could find a tool like this being used in your school. So take a minute to read that first paragraph. I'm going to ask you, what's Traxeline? Who can tell me what Traxeline is?
It's a form of Zyme.
Very good. You guys really worked hard. And where is it Montil? Good. And how is it Quasel? She's my high performer. Really good. Nice job. Nice job. And why is it so important to know about Traxeline? Okay. So if I gave you enough time, you'd all do really well on this test, right? And what would you remember tomorrow? Okay. So why does that happen? What are we doing when we do this? Any reading teachers here? It's low level. We're using our understanding of syntax to try to answer questions, and we don't have any understanding. We've pushed through getting the answer, and we don't have the understanding. And if you are teaching multiplication in a rote way, they may do well in those quick multiplication tasks, but they're not going to do well in 8th grade math. So everything we do is connected to everything somewhere else in the system. And if we don't take the time to develop understanding, and if we don't take the time to engage students in something that feels meaningful to them, so they actually want to hold on to it, we're not just hurting them in the present, but we're also hurting them down the road. So I just want to leave that out there. That's our challenge. Again, if this was really, really easy, we would have done it. But it's not an individual task. It's something we have to do together. One of the things that I find so fascinating about the newest research on teacher value-added models is they're starting to show that it's actually not an individual teacher quality, it's a group quality, which is so profound. If I take the highest scoring teacher in a high-performing school and throw them into a low-performing school, guess what? They will be a low-performing teacher. It is not about you as an individual, it's about you and your team. And it's about how we work together both within buildings and across buildings within a system to make sure that at every stage this is not happening. That our kids really understand what it is they need to know, that they learn fractions before they get to algebra, so that they have that strong foundation that they need so that the learning that they're doing is appropriate and they're able to actually succeed. So it's such an honor. I think I've gone way over my time. But I hate coming here because it makes me jealous because I really think you have the most exciting job in the field. And someone asked me the other day, and I said this yesterday, what teaching was like, and I said, well, it's like getting to watch a child learn how to walk every day. And if you're a parent, you know what I mean. Our job is so hard, and there are days when you want to cry because you feel like you've been in a washing machine all day, and there are days when you want to cry because you're so proud and you've got to watch a child walk, whether it's in math or something else. And so really, thank you from the bottom of our hearts at the agency. Thank you on behalf of all the children in Vermont for the good work you do. Please take advantage of our team, and don't let No Child Left Behind get you down. We have much more important things to focus on. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to thank Rebecca